Okay, so here are the pattern pieces for the pattern for 7/20/16 number 114 dress. These are the pattern pieces that are going to be used to make the plastron, which is where I'm going to weave them to create the basket weave. This is supposed to be cut in a washable backing where you're supposed to do the weaving and get it to stay, but I don't have that, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to figure that out. And then I have my button band over here, and these are the rest of the pattern pieces already on the fabric. So I'm using, this is a Robert Kaufman chambray, denim chambray fabric. This has already been pre-washed, and so it doesn't quite have the same deep indigo that it has when you first buy it. Okay, so even though I traced out the pattern pieces for the blouse, I actually want to lengthen it into a shirt dress. And the length of the top goes, it hits about my hip, and I need to add enough for it to get to just above my knee. And by my calculations, I need to add 14 inches. So what I'm going to do is, so starting off with the back piece, I'll just line it up and then make sure that I'm adding 14 inches. So this is the 14-inch mark. So then I'm just going to be cutting it here. And I have to do that, adding this 14 inches for the back, which is cut on a fold, and for the front, for the two front pieces, and for the button band. So 1, 2, 3 are the ones that are going to get lengthened by 14 inches so that it's going to hit my knee length. And then another thing to note is I traced this without the seam allowance, so I have to remember to add my seam allowances. The neck band is just going to be a bias strip of fabric. Okay, so I am going to chalk this out and then I will record the cutting. Okay, so here we now have the main pattern pieces ready to cut out. So I've added the 14 inches from here right down to here. This is my tailor's chalk mark, and I've done that for the front as well, and then I'll do that for the button band. So I'm going to cut these out, and then I'll do the plastron pieces separately by themselves. So I'm just going to eyeball it because I traced this without seam allowances, but I'm quite okay with cutting out and eyeballing the seam allowances that I'm going to be using, which in this case is 1/2 inch. So the main pattern pieces have been cut, but I've just decided that I want to add some pockets to it, and I've got this sort of standard pocket template which I use for inseam pockets, and it's got a 1/2 inch seam allowance already traced in, which is pretty awesome. So I'm just going to use that, and I'll cut my 4 pieces and I will add pockets to the pattern, so the pattern doesn't have pockets. Okay, so I'm playing around with ideas for the plastron. It has to be woven, so I'm kind of considering using the reverse fabric of the chambray because it's got this interesting texture as well, which I think is a nice contrast for the deep blue. So I've used some scrap pieces of fabric to see what that might look like. So this would be the original, which is just normal color or normal color, but this is what it might look like. I have to make a choice now, and as of this moment I am undecided, so I'll have to see how it goes. So for this project I'm using my 1932 Singer 201K, which is in a cupboard. It's not a treadle or anything, it's electric, but it's set in a cupboard that's got like an extendable working space. I have just put in a new 70 needle, which I think is just right. I've done my test sewing on a scrap of fabric, and I'm quite happy with how it is. And I'm going to start off with the Plastron bits. So I've sewn up one of the horizontal woven ones, which I've decided to go with the reverse so I can do a contrast. And I've just pressed it, turned it inside out and pressed it in. So I'm just going to check that it's fitting the intended stripe on the template pattern piece. So this is supposed to be going like this. So you can see that line there and that line there. So I'm happy with that. So now I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the 9 strips because that's quite okay. Okay, so these have all been sewn, trimmed, turned round, and also pressed, so they're nice and flat. So I've got my template right here, and these are the vertical stripes, and I've just been pinning these along the line so that they don't move. And now I'm getting ready to do the weave, so I'm just gonna slide this out. And then we have it, and so now I have to sort of lift that and put it underneath. This is so hard to do with one hand. Okay. I'm going to do that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a pin. I'm going to pin it down so that that doesn't move, and then I'll keep on doing that until I've finished this.
Okay, so this is what it looks like when everything has been woven through and pinned down. And at this point, it's a great idea just to use your template and just to check and make sure that everything is lined up as you would expect it to. So the next thing that I did was I basted this together, because obviously if you try and lift this up, it's just going to come apart. And so I used these long basting stitches so that we had this one piece of woven fabric. And yeah, then the next step was to take the template, put the template over it, and cut around it, including your seam allowances, because this template doesn't actually include the seam allowances, so you need to remember to add your seam allowances, or you can add them at the tracing stage, but I tend not to use my seam allowances. So this is what you would expect it to look like. This is with just the front laid over the plastron, and there we have the plastron then sewn on and with the button placket. I do apologize, my phone ran out of battery, so I didn't record the intervening steps, but you kind of get the idea. And so you then cut out your neckline with your seam allowances added to it, and I just did a bit of basting so that it wouldn't come apart. And then the next thing was to sew up those shoulder seams, overlock them, and then do some top stitching on there, just like I did the top stitching on that shoulder yoke. And so that's what it looks like now once it has been top stitched. And I also did some stay stitching around the neckline. The neckline is going to be finished with bias binding, so it's a really super quick, fast and easy way to finish a neckline. And you can see on there what the bias binding would look like with the first stage, where you've sewn it on to the neckline and then you sort of turn it over and under. And it's really up to you how wide you want your bias binding to be. I think I went with 1.5 inches wide bias binding, and that just worked out well for me. That's the stage where I've turned the bias binding under, and I'm just getting ready to fold it under again so that I can do the final stitch in the ditch. But before I do the final stitch in the ditch, what I do is I make sure that everything is folded under in the way that it's supposed to, and then I fold the bias binding right sides together and then just sew a straight line, as you can see, so that I can then just turn it the right side out and it will encase the neck binding. So you can see on there that I've sewn that at the front where the buttonhole is, but not catching your button placket. By the way, you want to make sure that you're not catching your button placket. And there we go, we're just trimming it. So I prefer to trim it after I've done this so that I don't run the risk of having too little bias binding. And then when you sort of turn it under, it creates a beautiful casing for your neckline. This is the first time that I've used this sort of a finish on a neckline, and I have to say it is pretty sweet. I like it, and it's something that I'll definitely be using again because it does make for a really neat finish. And I'm just trying to get the camera to focus on there because it was really quite hard to try and get it to show you exactly what I mean. So then you have the option of, once you've turned it under there, you can stitch in the ditch, or it's also called crack stitching, where you sew right along that seam, and so you won't be able to see the stitching details, or you can hand sew it if you prefer. I hand sewed mine on because I didn't want to have any stitching showing through. Plus I love hand sewing. It's part of the joy of sewing my own garments for me. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to attach those pockets. And now for me, I used an old shirt. So this is a shirt that my husband was wearing until recently, but the collar was completely torn on it, and it's a really lovely fabric. It's a Uniqlo shirt, and I really like the fabric, and I do tend to reuse old shirts to make pockets. And so I cut out my 4 pocket pattern pieces, and then I added those. I add my pockets 2 inches below the waistline. That's the sweet spot for me. And it's very simple, really. All I do is I overlock all of the pocket pattern pieces, finish them, and then I attach them at that point where it's 2 inches below the marked waistline of the sewing pattern. And I'm just going to follow the standard procedure for sewing your inseam pockets, which is to first of all attach the pocket piece to your main pattern piece within the seam allowance, and then you sew up the side seam and the undersleeve seam. And that makes for a really beautifully finished dress that is just absolutely stunning and amazing. I feel so accomplished having sewn up this dress because that placket required so much work and effort on my part, and it was totally worth it. And especially working with this tencel fabric, which apparently is a really great sustainable fabric for those of you that are into sustainable sewing. It's really, really fantastic. I do have a blog post that you can go read up if you want a bit more detail on this, and I hope that you've enjoyed the post and that you did find it useful. If you did, please do give it a big thumbs up down below, and don't forget to subscribe for new sewing related videos every week. And until I see you next time, happy sewing. Bye.